This is Cultural Debris with host Alan Cornett.
Welcome back to Cultural Debris. Summer is, I hope, on its last legs. I admit to looking forward to cords, sweaters, and boots this fall. That said, I'm trying to squeeze in as much Madras and seersucker as I can before summer comes to a close. Some late-planted cosmos are starting to bloom, and my hydrangea starts seem to be rooting for the most part. I plan to plant those after Labor Day. I recently returned from a trip to Minneapolis with my colleague Tom Ruby and his neighbor Darren, my first ever visit to the Twin Cities outside of the airport. I was there for the G.K. Chesterton Conference, where I also spoke on Russell Kirk and G.K. Chesterton. A fun time was had by all. I also had the good pleasure of meeting Bishop Robert Barron, who is the conference keynote speaker. That was quite an honor for me, as I am a great admirer of his and the work that he has done and is doing. It was great to see some friends from last fall's Cultural Debris Excursions. Dale and Laura Alquist were there, of course, along with Adrian Alquist and Josh McCoon. I also got to meet longtime Twitter mutual Percy Grice, a nom de plume. Mr. Grice kindly gifted me with an anthology of short stories, all centered on books and bookshops, called Shelf Life. You won't be surprised to learn it wasn't the only book to follow me home. Speaking of Cultural Debris Excursions, you can visit culturaldebriexcursions.com for information on our upcoming trips to Italy and Spain, both this fall and in 2024. The website is new and under construction, so be patient, but more will be coming soon. We'd love to have you go with us on our small group trips. My guest is not the only one active in theater right now. This month, I was again in a parish play written by one of our priests, Father Al Diagiacamo, who, in a past life, was a theater professor. Some may recall last year's production of Dorothy Day, which I talked about. This year's play was on Blessed Father Michael McGivney, the founder of the Knights of Columbus. Father McGivney also produced parish theatricals, and so the play had scenes from one of the plays he produced within the broader play. It was a lot of fun, but I don't suspect that Broadway will be calling. Since we are on a theater theme this episode, my friend Jane Clark Scharl sent me a copy of her new play, Sonnez les Matines, which features John Calvin, Ignatius of Loyola, and Francois Rabelais as characters in a murder mystery, which they themselves are suspects. It is from Wise Blood Books, and I'll have a link that you can click to track down a copy. I'm reading it right now. Our poem is by Oscar Wilde, The Theater at Argos. Nettles and poppy mar each rock-hewn seat. No poet crowned with olive deathlessly chants his glad song, nor clamorous tragedy startles the air. Green corn is waving sweet where once the chorus danced to measures fleet. Far to the east a purple stretch of sea, the cliffs of gold that prisoned Danae and desecrated Argos at my feet. No season now to mourn the days of old, a nation's shipwreck on the rocks of time, or the dread storms of all-devouring fate, for now the peoples clamor at our gate. The world is full of plague and sin and crime, and God himself is half dethroned for gold. My guest is Laird Mackintosh, a longtime Broadway actor who had the opportunity and privilege to play the Phantom himself in the final performances of The Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom closed in April after 35 years on Broadway and was Broadway's longest-running show. Laird discusses playing the Phantom, his long association with the show, and the unpredictable life of being a Broadway actor. In addition, he and I discuss his interest in vintage Ralph Lauren clothing and the business that sprang from it. Plus, Laird is an art lover and an artist, so we discuss our mutual admiration for the great John Singer Sargent. Please join me as I talk with Laird Mackintosh. Laird Mackintosh, welcome to Cultural Debris.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be here.
You clearly are not on tour right now. You seem to be settled in well at home. Are you on a break from any productions right now?
I'm on a permanent break. I mean, in the acting business, there are only permanent breaks. You're correct. I was on tour for prior to the pandemic, and then I was in production of the Lincoln Center production of My Fair Lady, and that show was shut down shortly after we started due to the pandemic. But fortunately, we came back and resumed the tour. Everybody who was involved got to come back, which was fortunate because a lot of tours, and even a number of Broadway shows, once the pandemic really settled into its long residence, producers of a lot of shows just shut them down, and casts who had thought they were taking 2 weeks off due to this COVID outbreak realized they weren't coming back to their jobs. But luckily, our producers kept us, and we came back, and after doing I think we only did about 4 months initially. Then we had like a year and a half off, and then we came back for more than a year. So we were really, really fortunate. So that was sort of 2019 through 2022. And
well, very good.
So like everyone else, we experienced an odyssey at that time. I mean, I'm talking about me and my wife. And because she was on the tour with me, and she's also an actor and dancer, and but we met working at Phantom of the Opera on Broadway, and my wife was the production dance supervisor. The show, as you probably know, has closed now after 35 years, which was a shock to everybody involved. While we were doing My Fair Lady, she was able to take a leave of absence, but I had to leave Phantom to do My Fair Lady. So when the pandemic juggled everybody's returns, when those shows started to plot their reopenings, which was a whole logistical epic, you can imagine, like a touring company, we were going from city to city 1 week at a time, sometimes 2 weeks. If we were lucky, we were somewhere for 3 weeks or a month with My Fair Lady. And they have to book all of those cities well, years in advance. Sure. Yeah. And so all of these tours were suddenly trying to rebook and reopen after when they thought the pandemic might be opening up. And similarly, Phantom of the Opera reopened on Broadway. But my wife's schedule no longer lined up with the reopening. And so we both looked at each other and knew that what she had to do was to leave My Fair Lady and go back to Phantom. And because of the nature of the relaunch at Phantom, she's very much involved in the staging of the show. And so we knew she would be valuable there and needed more than she might have been on My Fair Lady. And so she went back to Phantom, but it meant that we were apart for that year. So I went back out on the road with the show, and what we thought was going to be an experience touring around together, we actually ended up being, having a year apart. So, which is part of the life that we all live, and we're certainly all used to it in the theater business. But it made for I used that word, an odyssey. It made it even more of an odyssey and kind of unexpected adventure. But and then, of course, that brings us up to the last year, and I was super lucky because I was able to get back in at the tail end once it was announced that Phantom was closing. There was a little bit of juggling of cast here and there, and some people had some time off, and I was able to get back into the show as a cover and as a, replacing people for a month at a time or a couple weeks at a time. So I had a very lucky return to Phantom in the last year in little snippets, and then I had a unbelievably lucky on the very last day, which
Right.
is another story. But when the show was closing, our principal Phantom, unfortunately, was exhausted vocally, and his doctor had told him, "You actually cannot sing. You have to stop singing." Really, doctor's orders for his vocal health. And at the last second, I got put on for the final performance of Phantom as the Phantom.
Yeah, which is really amazing. I remember seeing your posts about that, and I was like, "Well, that's an amazing thing to happen." I mean,
It was just a huge honor. I could not believe it, and I was having an out of body experience the whole time. Well, both out of body experience and also a kind of deeply Zen sort of, like, I got into a focused state like I've never been in my performing life, because the audience they actually didn't sell tickets for the final show. The last public show was the night before, and I did that one as well. I did the three shows leading up to the closing, with the exception of the matinee the day before. One of our other guys did that show. But for the final show, the audience was entirely made up of alumni of the show, people who had been in the Broadway production, 15 or 20 guys who had played the Phantom, and of course all of the creatives. So Andrew Lloyd Webber was there, and Cameron Mackintosh, the producer. And so it to say that it was, there was pressure.
Oh, well, I can't even imagine, especially, I mean, not only having Andrew Lloyd Webber there, but all of these previous Phantom actors. I would think that would be quite a weight, because all of them are thinking, well, I could do that.
Yeah, of course. Well, but actually, I think of course, the room was just completely full of love and a deep feeling of emotion, I think, for the people, because the show has meant so much to the people involved. It's so unusual that a show would run for 35 years. Of course, it's the longest running show ever on Broadway, and that is extremely unusual. And so it had a feeling of a home and a family and long relationships, and of course all the ups and downs and the dysfunctional relationships that you have in a family, but also the kind of deep sense of camaraderie and love and affection. And it truly felt like the end of an era. And I think because it was so unexpected for the cast and crew and orchestra to hear this news, it just came. I thought that I would be gone before Phantom was gone. I just thought it would continue. But of course, the pandemic hit tourism in New York and still has affected it very, very deeply. So we don't have the international audiences that we used to have. And international visitors to New York might come into the city for the weekend, and they might want to see one show. And quite often it was Phantom, just because of the iconic place that it has, not only as a Broadway show, but also so much connected with the sense of Broadway, or excuse me, of New York City, connected with, Phantom sort of is Broadway, New York City, in the minds of some people, I think. So anyhow, I think we're all still in withdrawal and still adjusting to life. I mean, my wife was in the show for almost 20 years, off and on. She left and came back and took leave of absences and was able to do other shows. But so we feel very, very sad about it.
Oh,
But
I'm sure.
did I say that already? Probably 10 times.
Well, I mean, you yourself have had really a decades long relationship with the show going back
Yes, well, I
to
first
your
did the
very early
show
days.
because I'm from Canada originally, and I first did the show in the 90s in Toronto. There was a production that ran for a decade in Toronto. And so, I began as a young man in that show. And then always when I got the opportunity to live and work in the States, I always wanted to be in the Broadway production. And I had auditioned for it a number of times, but finally I aged up into another role in the show. And suddenly I was playing this. If you had told me when I was 25 years old that you're going to be playing the role of Andre, which is an older character in the show sometime, I wouldn't have believed it. But, I aged up into that role and suddenly was able to play it. And so that was another incredible gift my life would be completely different if I had not been involved in Phantom. There's a lot of other things that I've done in my life, but that I can't deny that that's a big chunk. When you've done a show for 11 years in total, it's a big, that's a fifth of my life that I've been on stage doing that show, and just thousands of performances. So,
well, so having that many performances, having that affiliation for so long, I can understand on the one hand that it would feel like home. It's a comfortable place to be. On the other hand, do actors get bored with that? Do you get tired of doing the same show, the same production time after time?
Well, yes, I think you do. And I think that is the challenge of being in a long running show. But I don't think anybody would put in the balance. No one would. I never felt like I complained about that, because I was always, especially after I had left the show of my own accord in Toronto, and then always forevermore afterwards asked myself, why did I ever leave that show while it was still running? I left for a couple of years and had a dry spell and didn't. I guess I didn't have a dry spell. I did some other things, but when I then came back into the Toronto production for its last phase, similar to what happened in New York. But yes, of course, people get. I would be lying if I didn't say that people get. Not only do they get bored of the job of doing the show, but they get. It becomes can be mentally exhausting, I think, because the rigorous thing about it is that, you have to, for the audience, you have to make it appear to be fresh, of course. And, but it does have to have an absolute machine-like operation, because you're working, especially in a show like Phantom, there's extremely intricate backstage choreography, and everybody does their tracks the same way every show. You walk to the same place backstage, you pass the same person in the hallway, you step out of their way at the same time while they run through, you grab this thing from that crew person at the same time. It's absolutely choreographed. And so there is an order to that you have to adhere to, and that can become exhausting. But despite that, I think everybody involved in the show, I know everyone would say that they were obviously, so grateful to have been a part of it. There's 10,000 actors in New York who would have killed to have had my job in the last 5 or 6 years.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. You talked about Phantom having, I guess, being kind of a flag, for lack of a better word, a flagship Broadway show. It's so tied to Broadway in people's minds. It's so tied to New York in people's minds. And I guess, is there something that's going to step in and take that place? Does Broadway as a whole suffer even more because of the lack of having something like Phantom? So, maybe I want to go see Phantom, but it's sold out. Oh, well, I'll go see something else, perhaps. But if you don't have Phantom as that draw, is that going to have a negative ripple effect throughout Broadway in general?
Well, actually, I think it might have a bit of a ripple effect in that it was one of the big, it does say something about the business of Broadway right now that one of the juggernaut, the Titanic of Broadway has sunk. And perhaps that's not the right analogy or metaphor, but because it didn't sink, it was enormously successful. But the fact that it has closed and that the reason that we were given was that it was due to slow business. That was prior to when they announced the closing. Then we had basically a year of the show just being like jam packed, or 6 months, whatever it was. I mean, you couldn't get a ticket. So it was all the more strange. The feeling of the closing felt like the opening of the biggest show on Broadway because the audiences were going crazy. You couldn't get tickets, and I'm sure that they could have extended it had they wanted to, but actually the producers felt like they wanted to say they were closing on this date and they were going to close on this date. I think they were deeply aware of people saying, oh, they're just doing this to try and drum up ticket sales and they're never going to close. But they did close when they said they were going to close. We extended once and for a month or something, but that was it. I'm sure they could have kept going for 5 more years or indefinitely. But there is a ripple effect, I think, because good business, of course, has a ripple effect. But there will always be fantastic, wonderful shows on Broadway. I've just been to see a bunch of them. And of course, everybody in show business wants there to be a newness. But I think even if they open Phantom again on Broadway, it will never be the original production in the Majestic Theater, in that historic house and historic production, running in a very, one of our conductors said to me that, well, there will just never be anything like this on Broadway again, in the sense that we had the biggest orchestra on Broadway. Occasionally a show would come in and they'd add one more orchestra player so they could say they had the biggest show on Broadway. No, they did. But I mean, continuously, Phantom had the biggest orchestra on Broadway.
Right.
It employed a gigantic number of, it had a huge crew, which you have less of now because things are automated more and run by computers. And the orchestras are, producers now, I think they want a show that has a cast of 12 people and an orchestra of, it's not an orchestra, a band of 5 players and, a crew of whatever. They wanted to cut the costs. I guess they have to, but this old fashioned production that was so highly theatrical and romantic for people is gone now. And so I do think that's too bad.
We have a rise of streaming services and now Apple's finally releasing this virtual reality, that people have been talking about for a long time. Is there going to be a place, and what is the value for the sort of embodied experience, the seeing a real live actor doing a real live performance on a stage? What value does that bring going forward that these other experiences can't give us?
Well, I think the value of theater is that you're sharing a communal experience with people in the moment, and it only happens once. Of course, it's live, and so when whatever happens, the audience is truly participating with the actors. There's a relationship there, and of course, even in my time, in our time, I can see that we've gone through a sea change in the title of your podcast, cultural, is it debris?
Yeah, cultural debris.
I was going to say cultural, cultural remains. The cultural debris
could also work.
Yes, the world has changed, and not for the better, I'm sure, with the age of the internet and social media, or a double-edged sword. In many ways, incredibly exciting, and I suppose, of course, for the better, but in many ways, I think not for the better. And it has to do with isolation. I think people are much more isolated now, and obviously, those kinds of things that we do as a community, at least I know in my mind, are better for us, I think. And theater is one of those things, but also an appreciation of the fine arts we're in a, I don't think there's any denying that we're in a drastic decline of people's interest in fine art, fine music, and I'm a art lover and a museum goer and a lover of classical music and all of those things. And I also have bad taste in things, but I was lucky. And it's weird. Like when I reflect on my youth, I started my career as a ballet dancer in the National Ballet of Canada. And I had sort of a 5-year stint where from high school, I went to a drama program in the Rocky Mountains in Banff, near my home in Calgary, Alberta, as an acting student. And there was a ballet school at the same school, same time. And I somehow got the bug for that. And in retrospect, looking back on it, I realized that because there was an aesthetic feeling about the world of ballet that I just absolutely loved. I saw a Balanchine ballet called Serenade, which has Tchaikovsky's, I think the music is the Serenade in C or Symphony in C. Serenade in C major is the music, and it's just a sublime piece of music. And the ballet itself is not a plot. It's not a story ballet. It's an abstract ballet. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted by the beauty of this thing. And then, I got into the ballet world, and now I realize, thinking back about it, that my daily existence, because when you go into the ballet class, you spend an hour in the morning and you do this ballet bar to begin your day, and the pianist is playing all this classical music or ballet music. And then you go and rehearse with classical music, and you're doing ballet, obviously, so it's a fine art form. And then at night you go and you're working or performing with the symphony orchestra, and at the same time I was singing in the opera chorus, because I was a singer as well then as a young person. And so then, like in my other work, I was working with, in a very small capacity, but I was a chorister with like the Montreal Opera, and hearing all of that music. So that my early part of my life had this nonstop surfeit of classical music and fine art, and hopefully some of it has stayed with me. But I also realize what I had then and what is gone now. I don't know what I'm trying to say with that, but well, I suppose it has always stuck with me that I try to keep some of that in my life somehow. So now I can, when I was touring around with My Fair Lady, I had the opportunity to go to every museum across the States, which was wonderful, and just trying to keep some element of that in my life.
Well, I do want to talk to you about that, but hold that thought about the regional museums.
Okay.
We're gonna circle back around on that. So if I find myself, or one of our listeners or viewers find themselves in New York, or there's a touring show, what are some shows right now that you would think would be particularly good for folks to see, for their own benefit, and to also to support the Broadway production industry?
Well, I absolutely loved New York, New York, which is a new show. Loved it, and I loved Some Like It Hot, which is a new show that's been highly. Trying to think of what I haven't seen Sweeney Todd yet, but I want to see that. Those would probably be the two that I would really recommend somebody go see.
Are there any touring productions right now that you are aware of that
Yeah, I mean,
you might send people to?
well, the tours typically, of course, they go out at the tail end of a run on Broadway or just after a show's had its run on Broadway. And so I'm trying to think. I mean, I know the show that I did, My Fair Lady, it actually, they do something that I don't think they should do, but the producers do it. They once the show has toured for a while, they close the show. It's an equity tour. We're all members of the Actors Equity, and then they reopen it, and it's non-equity. So, and they continue to tour it, but the audiences, there's no change in the advertising. The audiences have no idea they're seeing a non-equity cast. I don't know if they can advertise it anymore as the Lincoln Center production of My Fair Lady, but without disparaging the work of other actors or actors who are coming up in the industry, they're not equity actors, and and there's like the cast is made up of people who look like they're 20 years old playing Henry Higgins and Doolittle and Pickering and all this stuff. So I don't know. I don't know. Probably I've said too much. If I should recommend the production of, I have too much of a vested interest in my old production of My Fair Lady. But yes, I mean, I know that when we go around on tour, it's all of the regional theaters have a subscription offering that is all the tours that are coming around from New York City and but I can't think off the top of my head what they are right now. I'm sorry.
Well, so tell me, a layman in these things, how the equity system works. How is that structured?
Well, it's much easier to get into equity now. I think, post pandemic, anyone can get into it practically. But there used to be a more rigorous sort of stages that you would have to go through to get your equity card. It was sort of like you can't get in without it, but you can't you can't work in equity. I mean, if you don't have the card, you can't get in, but you can't get in if you don't have the card. So, it's a union, and it is like any other union is meant to be strengthen numbers and be able to. And when we do have we're constantly. Our representatives are constantly going and trying to get better contracts for us working on the road, and it's a good thing to be a part of a union rather than a free for all.
Sure.
And so we have, when we're touring, we have there's a structure to what level of hotel you're supposed to be staying in, what your per diem is. The pay rates are all structured, and everything from the flights that we take from city to city, how long the bus ride can be, all of that. It's all governed by union rules, and those go, I presume, completely out the window when a production is non-equity. It's funny. It used to be 20 years ago that when a Broadway actor would go on a tour, the reason to go was because it was very lucrative. You would get lured away from Broadway to go on a tour, which I guess ostensibly the idea was that it was more difficult task to do, but you'd be compensated better for it. And it's not the case anymore. I mean, touring is not, it's just so difficult to get. The competition is so great now, and it's hard to get jobs in the business. So, really, really fine actors are, everybody's trying to go out on these tours now, but it's not like you're getting paid more than Broadway to do it. But, that's all part of the life and the way the business has changed.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit because I want to talk to you some about vintage Ralph Lauren.
Yeah.
which is which is an interest of yours. And
Yes, we're dressed
before we
similarly here.
we are. Well, I pulled out
I
this
like your
this
style.
vintage Ralph Lauren 3-2 roll linen, guaranteed to wrinkle according to the tag.
Yes, I love that. I love those
So
old labels.
so probably what, 80s, 90s? Would you
80s, I would say. Probably 80.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
unfortunately, I can't see it that well. The guaranteed to wrinkle,
right,
I cannot see that label at all.
yeah.
My screen is so. Does it have a yellow zigzag stitching around the label?
It does not.
Okay.
It does not have the yellow zigzag.
Well, that would, in my opinion, that is an earlier label, that type of stitching around it. But that would, I think, the guaranteed to wrinkle thing was definitely an '80s thing. It may have extended into the '90s a bit. I'm not sure, but it certainly is. I think did you post that on your Instagram account?
I did.
And
Yeah,
it's got
been a
like
while.
a window pane on it.
Right, it does.
Yeah, I
yes.
can't even see the window pane on the screen right now, but yes, I think that looked like an '80s jacket for sure, which is just what I
this
love.
was. Oh, me too. This is a thrift store, $5 sport coat. Trip to the dry cleaners, and it perked it right up. I typically am sort of opposed to dry cleaners because I think you can harm tailored clothing with too much dry cleaning, but sometimes it's good.
Yes.
And sometimes it's nice to freshen things up a little bit. And this one
especially when you
benefited
don't know
from
where they came from. I do that a lot.
Absolutely,
and I agree with
absolutely.
you. I don't like to do it with the vintage pieces, but sometimes it's necessary.
Sometimes it is. So, well, let me ask you this: when you travel on your tours, do you ever hit thrift stores around? I know you hit museums, which again we'll talk about.
Yes, I did sometimes. I can't remember where or what they were called, but I certainly did, and or vintage shops, when I could.
Right.
I had, when I came back from the My Fair Lady tour, I had because I'm upstate right now we have a little house upstate New York, but we also have an apartment in New York. And so, of course, when I was away on the tour, my wife was in the New York apartment and the house was empty for a while, or it wasn't empty, but it was empty of us. And I was sending things back from the tour because one of my I guess, you could say one of the habits that was like soothing me while I was out on tour was continuing to collect vintage polo. And so I was having it sent back to the apartment. And then when I came back, and my wife, God bless her, Polly was bringing all these things in from the doorman, and there was a wall of boxes that was like the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark when I got home. And I'm not kidding. It went floor to ceiling. But yes, I did enjoy looking around and trying to, that of course is, I think if you're an inveterate collector, and I can see just by looking at your collection of books behind you that you are, and I certainly am.
Possibly guilty of that.
Yes. I mean, as you know, the thrill of discovery and the excitement of finding something rare is really fun. And that's been one of the things that has fueled my polo collecting. You see, it began because when I was a teenager in my hometown of Calgary, this was back in the 80s, the polo stores were franchised. And so individual businessmen or businesswomen owned them and operated them. And there was a beautiful one that was in my hometown of Calgary, if you can believe that. But there were a number peppered across Canada. And there was an absolutely gorgeous one in Toronto. I actually worked there briefly when I lived in Toronto, but I worked for quite a while, a couple of years in the one when I was a teenager in Calgary. First thing, I walked in and was just like a window had been opened in my mind, seeing this store. And happened to be across the street from my high school, and I would hang around on my lunch break in this polo store. And then I can't remember if it was my like grade 12. I think it was when I was in grade 12 or just after high school. I started working there, and I took a year off and worked there full time. And so this seed was planted, and then in later life, um, I developed this gigantic sort of feeling of nostalgia for that era in my life, or that kind of sweet spot in my life, and the clothes that Ralph was, creating in that period of the 80s, which I happen to think, like, I happen to coincide with what I now feel was, and what I wrote about in a blog post once, that I called the golden era of Ralph Lauren production, which is sort of like, 1984, 83, 84. And for me, even more specifically pinpointed on 84, when the spring line was an epic campaign called Safari, and the fall was an equally epic and beautifully shot campaign called Thoroughbred. That I just, and it was right then that I was in the store, and so I can remember those catalogs we had. I still have them, and it struck a chord for me. But what's been fun about doing, starting to share this interest in collecting, and occasionally being able to put a piece up and have somebody, take it off my hands, is that I've realized that there is a worldwide interest in these vintage Ralph Lauren pieces.
So, was that Safari? Did that coincide with the Safari cologne and the Safari line that he released, or was that,
So
were those
that
separate?
predated it. The Safari cologne and perfume, I believe the perfume was launched first, and I think it was around 90, something like that, or it might have been 1992. I don't. I'm not.
So it was a little bit later.
Yes, it was later, and I believe the perfume came first, and then the cologne for men, and they did a beautiful line of. I'm actually very interested, of course, in all those fragrances that Ralph Lauren has done as well, because time has now. You I don't know if you're involved at all with the fragrance community, but like every other niche interest that you could possibly imagine, like if I had an interest in shoes that were made in Maine, you could get onto a group online that is interested in shoes made in Maine, or mugs, Wedgwood or something like that. Like it's.
I pulled out this vintage Ralph Lauren mug for
it.
you. So
that's Thoroughbred.
Yeah,
that has a box called Thoroughbred, I believe. I love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Safari was a that was the name they gave to a campaign, as a line that they did, and I believe it was shot in 1983, and famously, or at least interestingly, in the Ralph Lauren lore, it was not shot in Africa. They filmed it in Hawaii. I believe they shot it on Kauai. I could be wrong about that, but I know it was done in Hawaii. And Ralph famously said, "I've never been to Africa. This is my, kind of like everything else he did. It was a his version, his fantasy of it." And I don't say that in any denigrating way. I mean, I say that with admiration.
It's kind of a vision of the way, I guess, he thought it ought to be, like this. His vision of the English countryside, his all of these different worlds that he created. He was really kind of an early world builder in that sense.
I think it also it was something that early on showed to me Ralph Lauren in his absolute prime of his powers, doing two completely different feels or looks, or whatever you want to call it, because Thoroughbred was the English countryside, and they shot that. This was also before he launched his home lines. And so they shot it in an English country home. And the surroundings were a genuine English country home. Whereas nowadays they will film, he'll do a campaign, but it is more the surroundings, at least in my opinion, are often naturally they're meant to show his home wares that he sells as well. But this had the Thoroughbred campaign had an incredibly beautiful, to me, sort of look to it. And but this would just be the same as like if you were growing a teenager in the 90s, you probably would be crazy about all the what's that stuff called? The stadium stuff and Snow Beach and all that sort of thing, which is not my cup of tea. But that thing that Ralph Lauren did in the 80s was just is just ingrained in my mind, or it's one of the things that's ingrained in a very nostalgic way in my mind.
Well, you'll get no argument from me about holding the 80s up as sort of the pinnacle of time periods.
Uh-huh.
So I also come from the 80s as you do.
Right.
So you have launched then, and we should mention Eric Twardzik, who wrote the article a couple of years ago about this, and I'll link that in show notes so people can see. And Eric, of course, was a guest on an earlier episode a few months ago of Cultural Debris. But he wrote about your Instagram, I guess your vintage, is it Vintage PRL?
Correct.
Was that right? And I will also link that. People can hop over there and see it. But you show and also sell some overflow from the collection that you've accumulated. How was it simply I've got to clear out some of this stuff? Was that how it started?
Well, yes. During the pandemic, I said to Polly, I'm going to, sell some of these things on eBay that I have here and try to go through my collection and, part with a few pieces. And then I realized, I kind of enjoyed, putting them on a mannequin and photographing them and putting a necktie on a jacket and kind of playing around with the look of it. And then I realized, I'm making a little profit on these things. And suddenly, like a light went off in my head, and I said, and I turned to my wife and said, I'm going to start buying these things to flip them. Flip them is a cynical way of putting it. I'm going to buy these things to resell them. But it's not cynical because I absolutely love searching for, and trying to find really good old pieces. And the thing that I really enjoy about the Vintage PRL now is I no longer look for stuff just in my own size. You know what I mean? So I buy something if it doesn't fit me or it doesn't look like it's going to fit me. So I at some point decided maybe I'll just try to sell a few things via Instagram and communicate with sellers directly rather than putting them on eBay or some other, thing online. And that was merely because I wanted to, frankly, I wanted to avoid having to pay the fees on eBay.
Sure.
And I was amazed that complete strangers would send me money via PayPal. I mean, I would put up a tweed jacket and then somebody would say, well, how do I pay for it? And I would sheepishly say, are you okay with sending me the money into my PayPal account? And they'd just say, sure. The people were, and now that I've done it enough, somebody can look on my Instagram and see that at least I hope they will trust that it's obviously a legit thing. And I don't really get anybody who is concerned about sending money that way. So, although of late I have realized it's, the way I do it is I put a piece up and then I ask that the person direct message me, and then I send a file with all the measurements and a description of the item and the photos. And there's a lot of going back and forth and discussion that would be allayed if I had what's the platform called? It's something like BidPay or something like that. You know, in other words, if I had a online store, which is obviously what anybody does who has a vintage business or something like that online. So I'm very seriously considering doing that. And I'm also considering, I'm quite interested in the idea of having a shop myself, because currently I have, you see, when I went back on the road then with My Fair Lady and then subsequently getting back into Phantom, I've stopped doing the thing online. So there's a lot of stops and starts with my vintage PRL, and occasionally I get a message from someone saying, are you still there? Like, are you still, are you going to be listing stuff again? And currently I have got about 50 pieces that I've photographed and measured, and they're all ready to go. I just haven't put them up yet. I'm very soon to be putting new things up online, so I'm excited about that. But I have 1,000, I've had to actually go outside of my house and rent I have a space now that I've rented to store. It's not a storage space. It's like a studio that I've rented to store and photograph all the stuff. And there's so much of it. So I have to sell it now at some point, because it's, I've invested quite a lot of funds into it. But, I must say, I really, really love it and really enjoy it. And it's true. There is nothing like the thrill of finding something that's really, really good.
Oh, that is absolutely the case. And that's why you always keep going back, even when you absolutely don't need anything. If I never purchased another thing, I would be, certainly more than fine. But it's the treasure hunt aspect of it. I can go into this shop where, it doesn't look like there's anything, and I can find the treasure that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't every time, and you won't every time, but sometimes you do. and in a sense, there are times when you've rescued that piece. It's something that very well could have been lost forever.
That's right.
And you've saved it. So there's, at least you tell yourself that. But I think it's also true that you do it. So I will tell those who are interested to absolutely check out the Instagram account, because it's beautifully done. And if nothing else, even if they don't purchase anything, they can get a lot of style inspiration, I think, from the things you put together and how you've conceived of it.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Maybe Ralph needs to hire you to come in.
I'd love that. I'm going up to Canada for a couple of weeks shortly to help my mother out with some things. But at the end of the month, I will be listing. I'll have a slew of new pieces up, new, old pieces.
So I will certainly tell people by the time that they are seeing this to absolutely check it out.
Oh, great!
There may be some new things. There may be some new things hitting. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, and I didn't want to let you go before we had a chance to chat about it, was your interest in art, which you've alluded to, and we can also see behind you some of that. But you are a particular devotee of John Singer Sargent, and I will say sort of helped inspire me to explore him myself. Now I have a big stack of John Singer Sargent books.
Yeah.
And I pulled this out, which
that's Beerbone.
Which I will show you. I also have a Vanity Fair print obsession. So this is and I like Max.
Yes.
And so this is Max and Vanity Fair and John Singer Sargent all rolled into one.
Yes.
So it's a great piece.
Yes, that's a wonderful portrait. I have that too. And I also love Vanity Fair prints and have a bunch of them, although I've collected a lot of them just in their, unframed state, and I don't have them. I actually just bought like about 10 of them like a week ago. I've always been, I first saw them in a Ralph Lauren ad. There was a line he did called Cricket in about 80. It was maybe 82, something like that, 83. And he used a trio of the Vanity Fair cricket prints in one of the pictures. But yes, I love those those caricatures, portraits, and that Sargent one is terrific. And there's another I don't have. There's another Bierbaum portrait of Sargent, which is him like kind of in side profile and sort of arching his back. Have you seen that one? And that one I don't.
I think I don't have that, but I think I have seen pictures.
Yeah.
Pictures of it online.
Yeah. Well, Sargent.
Max loved to illustrate his friends, and so he's got so many wonderful illustrations out there.
Yes. I have a couple Bierbaum books as well. Zuleika Dobson and some of his essays. I think it's called Mainly on the Air radio thing, pieces that he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have that one.
Yeah, but that novel, Dobson, is sublime. I love it. I've only read it once, but it's a great piece. And
so how did you, I guess, initially become interested in Sargent? And then I know you've toured around and hit all of these museums, finding Sargent pieces that are in maybe what we might consider obscure places, but they're out there.
Well, in sometime around 1995 or 1996, I was in a bookstore that's no longer there in Toronto called David Mirvish Bookshop, and was a beautiful art bookstore. And I saw that great big, I've got it back here, the big, somewhere here behind me. Anyway, the giant Sargent monograph. I believe the author is Carter Radcliffe, and it's familiar to a lot of Sargent aficionados. It has a big, beautiful, it's a large book, and it has the portrait of Lady Agnew on the cover, and just Sargent written across the top. And I'd never heard of him, but I saw the picture, and also something about the design of that cover was so striking with the portrait. And I bought the book and immediately became very, very taken with Sargent and interested in him. And then also in the late 90s, I bought a letter of Sargent's, a handwritten letter from a manuscript dealer in the UK. I think it was John Wilson Manuscripts. I believe that was the name of the dealer. And I was like completely amazed that you could buy a letter that Sargent had written. So I was holding this letter that he had touched. And, I'm one of those people that gets very excited by weird things like that. So I started trying to collect his letters. And in the 90s, my recollection of it was that in the early days of eBay, it was not I collected quite a few. And that seems to have slowed down or dried up now. I infrequently see a Sargent letter on eBay. And when I do, it is too expensive. They're really expensive to buy now. But of course, that was before there was an epic retrospective of Sargent's work at the National Gallery in Washington. And that would have been in the late 90s, I believe, or maybe around 2000, something like that. It was around that time. And that, I think, kicked off I don't know, it seemed to me anyway, that kicked off a resurgence of interest in Sargent that put up the prices on even things like his letters, which, of course, is just the very hem of the garment that I can just touch would be acquiring letters. I did buy 2 drawings, and I was able to show those. I had the opportunity to meet Richard Ormond a few years ago, who is the great, or perhaps it is great nephew of John Singer Sargent, Sargent's sister was married a man named Ormond, and Richard Ormond is now I believe he's an octogenarian and is now the I believe, considered to be the world expert on John Singer Sargent. And he is the author of, or the chief influence behind the Catalogue Raisonné, which has been completely done over the last 20 or 25 years, with the exception, I don't know if there's going to be a final volume that is, I believe he is currently working on trying to assemble all of the existing charcoal portraits, which is, of course, what Sargent did after, I believe it was 1907 or around 1907 that Sargent sort of declared, I'm stopping commissioned oil portraiture and I'm basically retiring and devoting myself to my own work for my own pleasure, watercolors and oil paintings, but, landscapes, etc. And, there was such a insatiable demand for his portraits that he agreed, I guess, to do charcoal drawings, charcoal portraits, which he could complete in one sitting. And but if I'm not mistaken, there's an enormous, something like 1,700 or 1,200 or 2,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, he did.
I have a volume of some of his charcoal portraits, but of course it's nowhere near that many of them.
Yes, there was recently an exhibit at the the name of the museum. I went to it it's just slipping my mind right now.
Yeah. I think that's City. Probably the catalog that I have.
Yeah, I'm looking. I've got a wall of his books here, and it's right behind me. But anyway, I can't pick it out right now. But anyway, it wasn't the Whitney, but it was it was downtown here in New York. It was a beautiful exhibit, and yes, and I believe Mr. Ormond was the curator of that exhibit. I know he was, and that was a good indication of the kind of, and the charcoal portraits are absolutely sublime. I mean, his skill, his gift as a draftsman had to be unparalleled. I can't think of, artists forever will be marveling at Sargent's. It was a gift from God. He was like a Baryshnikov of painting, or I don't know who you would compare it to, but just extraordinarily, supernaturally talented as an artist. And
yeah, I have to agree with you about that. But of course, he also opens up the door to a lot of other wonderful artists who I appreciate a great deal from that same time period. Of course, you have Whistler's probably the most well known, but also in different countries, you had Sorolla, you had Zorn, you had Boldini. All those guys were doing this beautiful work, overlapping, not exact contemporaries, but it's a similar approach and beautiful style.
Yes. Oh, I love all of those artists that you just mentioned. And there's a wonderful account, and I could not find where I had it, but it's the Franco Maria Ricci. Do you know those publications, those magazines that were published, FMR? They did a wonderful volume on Boldini that I have. There's like a slipcased, book that they did on him. Yeah. But in one of the magazines, they reproduced an account of that they translated into English of a art student or art lover who went to visit Boldini at his studio in old age, and it's a beautifully evocative story of going into this studio of this great artist, and canvases everywhere. And he was another magician. I love Boldini. In fact, I have a Boldini signature that I bought some time ago, like while I was collecting all the Sargent letters, and it's a letter written in another hand. I think in the hand of his wife, who was considerably younger than him, and I believe was sort of took care of his business affairs. And then it's got his beautiful signature at the bottom that's so familiar from the portraits, because he had that highly stylized way of writing his name. But yeah, I love Boldini, and Zorn and Soroya, and also the other early 20th century and mid-war portrait painters, Orpen. I love that, and as you say, it's not only a window into other artists, but it's a window, of course, into the time and the period, and undeniably, what I love about those painters and their pictures is the style of their painting and the style of the people in the pictures. They're so beautiful to look at, and of course, people, I think, really, had a sense that life was valuable and that worth living, and that dressing with a sense of occasion meant that the day was important, and something that there was a reason to put your best self forward, and you really see that in those pictures, I think, and in the way people took the care to dress themselves.
You have shared a few times some of your own painting that you've worked on.
Oh yes,
I know you did a copy of a Munnings, I believe,
yes.
And you painted a self. It had a self portrait of yourself in a top hat.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it sounds very. It sounds very showy the way you just but it's true. It is true. With the top hat.
No, they're beautiful pieces.
There was a portrait that I saw that really inspired that self portrait, and it was now I'm really going to forget. I put it on my Instagram account, but who was the actor that was not in the James Cameron Titanic movie, but in the old 1950s A Night to Remember? Famous British actor with a little mustache. Famous actor. Anyway, that gentleman. There was a portrait of him that I have not been able to see in person, although I tracked it down. It's in New York, somewhere in the archives of the New York Theater Historical Society or something like that. And I did get in touch with someone there who was able to send me an image of the painting, rather a color image of it, a small color image. And what struck me, it's a portrait of a man in white tie, but it's indoors. He's seated in a chair, but he's wearing his top hat. And for some reason that made me indoors, and I thought that was kind of striking. So somehow I thought I'm going to do an homage to that picture. And then it kind of ended up looking like a picture of me in the ball scene from My Fair Lady, because I wore the same outfit. But yeah, and then the Munnings painting, I absolutely adore Alfred Munnings, and that was an epic, like I copied that picture within an inch of its life, and so it took forever to do, but it's over the fireplace here. Nothing says nothing says humility like having a giant self-portrait and then putting this painting over the fireplace. But it has been, I am moving slowly but surely towards, my own work and doing my own paintings. But it's been a real learning experience for me to copy pictures, which of course is one of the traditional ways of trying to learn, or at least when you're trying to be self-taught. That's another fantasy of mine. Like, I would love to be a painter, and
well, it seems that you are one. To be one, you just paint. Correct?
Yes, that's right. But I think real painters paint 9 to 5 every day, all day long, and that's how you do it. And my interests are too divided to focus enough on it, but I do love it and enjoy it, and I do harbor a fantasy of perhaps doing it more in the future.
You can be a painter in the lineage of Winston Churchill.
Yes, right.
He had other things going on too. So, but
right. And don't you wish you had
some...
started collecting Churchill paintings like 45 years ago? Or I think they're completely untouchable now as well. But
I
think there was a time not too long ago when you could buy one. But those things have all become so expensive. And that's another story. I mean, the art collecting world is also really interesting to me, and I do it in the smallest possible way. But I do really enjoy it as well. Occasionally you can buy some, I don't want to say minor work, but something by a good artist. You can get something just touching the hem of the garment.
Right.
Well,
and there are lots of pieces out there. I had an earlier episode some while back with William Newton, who's an art critic, and we discussed, and he collects art, particularly from Spain. But we discussed, the value of having art in your home, and it's not, you and I are both museum appreciators, but at the same time, it is valuable to have real art around you, and it's not something that should simply be a thing I go see, but rather something that surrounds me and that I live with. And I feel like that's art at its best. Not to say that obviously some of the great masterpieces are going to be in museums, understandably so, but I can see behind you have beautiful art, and it's something that you live with and you see and you appreciate, and obviously you love those pieces.
Yes, I absolutely love it. That bust that it's right there. I don't know if it's in your camera view. I'm touching the edge of it here now. No, sorry, in my room. Do you see it there, or is it out of view?
Yes. Oh, I can't. No, it's out of view.
That's yes. My friend Michael Shane Neal, who's a wonderful painter. Do you see
that?
Yes.
Yes.
It's difficult to see back there, and Rick Casali, the sculptor, just made that, and he has a way of the original, done in clay actually gets destroyed eventually, but he has a way of reproducing them using a contemporary sort of method of, it's like marble dust that they're able to, get into the mold, and it weighs a ton. But I was so taken with that piece that he did of my friend Shane that I said, I have to get one of those. And this will be, I love the idea when you read about Sargent, and actually I have in my collection of Sargent ephemera, I have one of the original catalogs of the sale of his the contents of his home and studio on Tite Street, on his death, and it lists everything that was in his possession that was sold. One of them, there's one catalog that is just his books, and I have a number of Sargent books here that he owned with his book plates in them. But one of them was all his artworks and studio furnishings and whatnot. I mean, he lived in the same building, or the two buildings that were his studios in London. But one of the things that impressed me so much, and you can see in some of the wonderful photographs of those evocative photographs of Sargent's beautiful studio that he had, were that he had the works of other artists in his possession. And I'm sure that he gave a painting to Boldini, who gave him a painting, and Elieu gave him a drawing, and he has one, but you can see them in in the photographs of his studio. And I love that idea of, not that I'm an artist who can give a work of art to another artist, but being able to acquire a contemporary work of art that is of having a portrait or a bust like this of a friend of mine. I really loved that idea. So I was able to get that piece from Rick Casali. And actually the original that he did just won the top prize, I believe, for sculpture at the the International Society of Portraiture conference that was just held a month ago. So I was really pleased about that. I have a a version of it here.
Yeah, it's it's a beautiful thing to have, and it's finding ways to acquire those things, and it can be expensive. It doesn't have to be expensive. We were talking about Vanity Fair prints; those are over a century old, but not, at least most of them, not that expensive to acquire. Really, you can find them pretty readily.
Yeah, and they are wonderful to live with. I love them. I love how you have one propped up there on your bookcase behind you.
Yeah, I've got so many that I have to find places to put them, and then I still have more that aren't up. So
or hanging there is. I love a picture hanging on a over a bookcase. That always looks so great.
Yes, I agree. I always think it's a nice look. Or sometimes it has to be moved in order to actually access the books, but that's not too much trouble.
Well, now,
so on your
go ahead. I was going to ask you. I was hearing on your podcast that you are going off to Salzburg. Is it?
Well, so that was a trip. So last fall we did our first trip to Genoa, Italy, and took two different groups of people. Incredible place. I don't know if you had a chance to go to Genoa. No. You should go with us. But it's a wonderful place. So we're doing Genoa again, and also a week in Tuscany prior to that. We're doing Siena and Florence for a week, and then they're going back to Genoa for a week. And so people can either do 1 week or both weeks. We do super small groups of my friend Tom Ruby and I are the ones who kind of direct those, but we have then 6 people. We could, depending on couples, we might flex up to 7 or so, but usually we focus on 6 people. So it's a super small group. You have a lot of flexibility that way. You can go do things that big tour groups can't do. So our hope had been to do a trip to Salzburg and also to Oberammergau and the area around there in the Alps. Alas, interest was more at this point in Italy. So we're going back to Italy for sure this fall, and perhaps we're looking at maybe Spain next year. I would love to do the trip to Salzburg, but we've got to round up the people who want to go.
Well, my dear friends in Toronto, who they run a Baroque opera company called Opera Atelier, and they perform internationally, and it's a husband and wife who are the director choreographer, and they have worked recently in Salzburg, and just said it was absolutely the most refined, sublime, civilized place they've ever been. They just adored it. Historic.
A few years ago, my wife, who sings in just sort of amateur choirs, her choir toured, did a European tour, and she was able to sing in Salzburg, and it was probably her favorite place that she went to.
Right,
she loved it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so neat. Well, I do hope you get to go sometime. I'd love to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let us know.
Exactly.
We'd love to have you. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation and you having time to talk to me. We could probably go on all day, but I know you've got a trip to Canada to get ready.
That's right. Well, we could go on all day, and hopefully we will at some point. We'll meet up in person sometime and continue.
I would love to. Well, you were in Cincinnati not too long ago. Maybe you can make it back there. We can hit the Ohio Bookstore and go to the Taft and the Cincinnati Museum of Art, which are excellent art museums.
Yes, and I was in the Ohio Bookstore, and in fact, I saw a book there that I subsequently called back, 6 months later and asked if they had, and it had sold, so I didn't get it. But I did buy a number of things from them, and what a great bookstore. Just like a block away from the theater that we performed in there.
And you just keep going up stories of books, and the lights come on.
Yes, that's right.
You're it's a fun place.
And the bookbinding downstairs.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. Yes, and you can. You can buy the little leather bookmarks that they have, and they have imprinted on there.
Fantastic.
And, so it's a fun place. It really is like a step back in time. There aren't many bookstores like that around.
No, that's so true.
Laird Mackintosh, I very much appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. You are conversant in many topics that I'm interested in conversing about. So I've enjoyed the
Yes,
chat.
Alan, and we didn't even touch them all, I don't think. So we'll get together sometime. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot.
All the best.